The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Millbrook, Montana, as Jake Morrison guided his weathered pickup truck past the town's modest collection of buildings. The autumn air carried a crisp bite that spoke of winter's approach, and the cottonwood trees lining the street had begun their annual transformation into brilliant yellows and oranges. Jake had made this same journey into town countless times over the past 15 years, ever since he'd inherited the Double M Ranch from his grandfather, but today felt different somehow. At 52, Jake had grown accustomed to solitude. His weathered hands gripped the steering wheel as he parked outside Henderson's General Store, the same establishment that had served the community for 3 generations. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and Martha Henderson looked up from behind the counter with her usual warm smile. "Morning, Jake. The usual supplies?" she asked, already reaching for the order list she kept pinned to the wall behind her. "That's right, Martha. Need to stock up before the weather turns." Jake's voice carried the measured cadence of a man who chose his words carefully. "How's Tom's arthritis treating him?" "Oh, you know how it is. The cold mornings have him moving like an old hound dog." Martha began gathering items from the shelves: coffee, canned goods, feed supplements, and the dozen other necessities that kept a ranch running through the harsh Montana winter. As Jake waited, he noticed the unusual quiet that had settled over the normally bustling store. Through the large front window, he could see a small crowd gathered near the old oak tree that stood in the center of the town square. Their voices carried on the morning air, though he couldn't make out the words. "What's all the commotion about?" Jake asked, nodding toward the window. Martha's expression darkened and she lowered her voice. "It's that Williams boy again. Caught him trying to steal food from the diner last night. Sheriff Murphy's talking about what to do with him." Jake frowned. He'd heard whispers about a homeless child who'd been living on the streets of Millbrook for the past few weeks, but he'd assumed it was just town gossip. "How old is this boy?" "Can't be more than 8 or 9, skinny as a rail and twice as stubborn." Martha shook her head sadly. "His mama left him at the bus station 3 weeks ago. Said she was going to find work in Billings and would send for him, but..." She trailed off with a meaningful look. "And nobody's taken him in?" The question came out sharper than Jake intended. Martha's hands stilled on the inventory sheet. "You know how it is, Jake. Times are hard for everyone. The Johnsons are struggling to feed their own 5 kids. The Pattersons are dealing with medical bills, and most of the other families." She sighed. "People are scared, taking in a strange child, especially one whose mama just abandoned him like that." Jake felt something tighten in his chest. He'd been abandoned once too, though he'd been lucky enough to have his grandfather step in. The memory of that confusion and fear, even 40 years later, still had the power to make his jaw clench. What's the sheriff planning to do? Social services from the county seat are supposed to come get him tomorrow. Ship him off to some group home in Helena, I suppose. Martha's voice carried a note of resignation that Jake had heard too often in small towns where resources were scarce and options were limited. Jake paid for his supplies in silence, his mind working through the implications. As he loaded the bags into his truck, he found himself walking toward the crowd rather than driving away. The conversations died down as he approached, and he could see the boy for the first time. The child was small for his age, with dark hair that looked like it hadn't seen a comb in weeks, and clothes that were too large for his thin frame. He sat with his back against the oak tree, arms wrapped around his knees, watching the adults discuss his fate with the wariness of a wild animal that had learned not to trust humans. His eyes were older than they should have been, carrying a weight that no child should bear. "Jake?" Sheriff Murphy nodded in acknowledgement. "Didn't expect to see you in town today. Needed supplies." Jake's attention remained fixed on the boy. "This the child everyone's talking about?" "Name's Danny Williams, 9 years old according to the ID his mother left with him." The sheriff's tone was professional but not unkind. "Can't stay on the streets much longer, especially with winter coming." Jake studied the boy's face and saw something that made his decision for him. It wasn't just the obvious signs of neglect. The hollow cheeks, the 2 bright eyes of someone who'd been hungry for too long, the careful way he held himself as if expecting another blow. It was the fierce determination in those young eyes, the refusal to cry or beg despite being completely alone in the world. "What if someone were willing to take him in?" Jake asked quietly. The crowd stirred with surprise. Sheriff Murphy raised an eyebrow. "You thinking about fostering Jake?" "I'm thinking about doing what's right." Jake stepped closer to the boy, crouching down to meet his eyes at the same level. "What's your name, son?" The boy's chin lifted slightly. "Danny." His voice was barely above a whisper, but there was no tremor in it. "I'm Jake. I run a ranch outside of town. You know anything about ranches, Danny?" The boy shook his head but didn't look away from Jake's face, as if trying to read his intentions. Well, there's always work to be done. Animals to feed, fences to mend, equipment to maintain. Could use an extra hand, especially someone young enough to crawl into spaces I can't reach anymore. Jake kept his voice gentle but matter-of-fact. You interested in learning? For the first time, something flickered across Danny's face. Not hope exactly, but a cautious curiosity that hadn't been there before. Why? Danny asked, the single word carrying the weight of too many disappointments. Jake considered the question seriously. Because everyone deserves a chance to prove what they're made of, and because that ranch gets mighty quiet with just me and the dogs. Sheriff Murphy cleared his throat. Jake, you sure about this? It's not just about good intentions. There's paperwork, home visits, background checks. I'm sure. Jake stood up, his decision made. What do I need to do? The next hour passed in a blur of phone calls and paperwork. Jake learned that Danny had been living on scraps from restaurant dumpsters and sleeping in doorways, always moving to avoid being caught by well-meaning adults who might turn him over to authorities. The boy had developed a network of hiding places throughout the small town, and his survival instincts were finely honed. As the temporary guardianship papers were signed, Jake noticed that Danny hadn't moved from his spot against the tree. The boy watched the proceedings with the detached interest of someone observing events that happened to other people. Well, Danny, Jake said when the paperwork was complete, ready to see what ranch life looks like? Danny stood slowly, his movements careful and controlled. He had no belongings except the clothes on his back and a small backpack that looked like it had seen better days. As they walked toward Jake's truck, Jake could feel the weight of the town's stares. They think you're crazy, Danny said matter-of-factly as Jake opened the passenger door. Jake paused, surprised by the boy's directness. What do you think? Danny climbed into the truck and buckled his seatbelt with practiced efficiency. I think crazy people are the only ones who do anything that matters. As they drove away from Millbrook, Jake found himself wondering what he'd gotten himself into. The Double M Ranch was 15 miles outside of town, accessible only by a winding dirt road that became impassable during heavy snows. It was a place where a man could live for weeks without seeing another soul, where the nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and where the work was hard and the winters were harder. But it was also a place where a boy could grow up learning the value of honest work, where the vastness of the Montana sky could heal wounds that urban environments only made worse, and where the simple act of caring for animals could teach lessons about responsibility and compassion that no classroom ever could. As the truck bounced along the familiar road toward home, Jake glanced at his passenger. Danny sat silently, taking in the landscape with the same careful attention he'd given to the adults discussing his future. The boy's hands were clasped tightly in his lap, and Jake could see the fine tremor that ran through them, not from fear exactly, but from the overwhelming uncertainty of having his entire world change in the space of a morning. You hungry, son? Jake asked as the ranch buildings came into view. Danny nodded, still not taking his eyes off the landscape rolling past the window. Well, let's see what we can rustle up for lunch and then I'll show you around the place. Fair warning, it's not fancy, but it's honest work and it's home. As they pulled into the yard of the Double M Ranch, Jake Morrison had no idea that his simple act of compassion would change not just Danny's life, but his own in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The Double M Ranch stretched across 2,000 acres of rolling Montana grassland, with the crazy mountains rising like ancient sentinels in the distance. As Jake's pickup truck rumbled up the dirt driveway, Danny pressed his face to the window, taking in his first glimpse of what might become home. The main house was a sturdy two-story structure built from local timber, weathered by decades of harsh winters, but still solid as the day Jake's grandfather had raised it in 1952. That's the main house, Jake said, following Danny's gaze. Built it to last through anything Mother Nature could throw at it. He pointed to a cluster of buildings beyond the house. Barns over there, along with the equipment shed and the bunkhouse where the seasonal hands stay during calving season. Danny nodded silently, his eyes cataloging every detail. Jake noticed how the boy's gaze lingered on the barn, where several horses could be seen moving in the paddock beyond. You ever been around horses, son? No, sir. Danny's voice was barely above a whisper. Mama said they were dangerous. Jake pulled the truck to a stop near the front porch and turned off the engine. The sudden silence was filled with the sounds of ranch life, the gentle lowing of cattle in the distance, the creak of windmill blades turning in the afternoon breeze, and the bark of Jake's 2 border collies as they came running to investigate the newcomer. Well, your mama wasn't entirely wrong, Jake said, opening his door. Horses are powerful animals and they demand respect, but they're not dangerous if you know how to be around them. Part of living on a ranch is learning to read animals, understanding what they need and what they're telling you. Danny climbed out of the truck more slowly, his eyes fixed on the approaching dogs. Both were black and white, their tails wagging enthusiastically as they bounded across the yard. "This here's Scout," Jake said, scratching behind the ears of the larger dog. "And this little tornado is Pepper. They're working dogs, bred to help with the cattle, but they're friendly enough once they get to know you." Danny stood perfectly still as the dogs approached, allowing them to sniff his outstretched hand. Scout, the older of the two, gave Danny's fingers a gentle lick before sitting down beside him, as if offering his approval of the new arrival. "Looks like you passed the test," Jake said with a small smile. "Scout's a good judge of character." The interior of the ranch house was as practical as its exterior suggested. The living room featured a stone fireplace surrounded by well-worn leather furniture, and the walls were lined with bookshelves and framed photographs of the ranch through the decades. Danny's eyes were drawn to a picture of a young Jake standing next to an older man in front of the barn. "That's my grandfather, Thomas Morrison," Jake explained, noticing Danny's interest. "He started this ranch with nothing but determination and a handful of cattle, taught me everything I know about ranching and a fair bit about life too." Danny nodded, still taking in the surroundings. The house felt lived in but not cluttered, functional but not sparse. It was clear that Jake lived alone, but it didn't feel lonely in the way Danny had expected. "Let me show you where you'll be staying," Jake said, leading the way upstairs. The second floor had 3 bedrooms, and Jake opened the door to the smallest one. It was simply furnished with a single bed, a dresser, and a desk positioned under the window that looked out over the ranch's main pasture. The walls were bare but freshly painted, and everything was clean and ready for occupancy. "This was my room when I was growing up," Jake said. "Figured it might suit you. We can fix it up however you like. Add some personal touches when you're ready." Danny set his backpack on the bed and walked to the window. From this vantage point, he could see the entire operation: the barn and corrals, the pastures dotted with cattle, and the endless expanse of grassland that stretched to the horizon. It was more space than he'd ever imagined one person could own. "How many cows do you have?" Danny asked, his first question since arriving at the ranch. "About 150 head of beef cattle, plus a dozen horses and some chickens," Jake replied. "It's not the biggest operation in the valley, but it's sustainable. We raise them on grass, sell them to buyers who appreciate quality over quantity." Danny was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Finally, he turned from the window to face Jake directly. "What do you want from me?" The question was asked without accusation, but with the wariness of someone who'd learned that nothing came without a price. Jake considered his answer carefully. "I want you to learn. I want you to find out what you're capable of when someone believes in you. And I want you to have a chance to be a kid while you're still young enough for it to matter. And if I mess up, then you learn from it and try again. That's how it works on a ranch, Danny. Mistakes are part of the process, not the end of the world." They spent the rest of the afternoon with Jake showing Danny around the property. The tour began at the barn, where Danny met the horses that would become central to ranch life. Jake introduced him to each animal by name, explaining their personalities and roles in the operation. "This is Belle," Jake said, approaching a gentle mare with a graying muzzle. "She's 22 years old and has been teaching people to ride for the last decade, patient as the day is long and smart enough to take care of inexperienced riders." Danny reached out tentatively to touch Belle's neck, surprised by the warmth and softness of her coat. The mare turned her head slightly to look at him, her large brown eyes calm and accepting. "She likes you," Jake observed. "Animals can sense things about people that we sometimes miss." Belle's never wrong about character. They moved on to the cattle operation, where Jake explained the seasonal rhythm of ranch life. Spring brought calving season. Summer was for moving cattle to different pastures. Fall meant sorting and selling, and winter required constant vigilance to keep the animals fed and healthy through the harsh Montana weather. "Each season has its challenges," Jake said, as they walked along the fence line of the main pasture. "But that's what makes it interesting. No 2 days are exactly alike, and you're always learning something new." Danny listened intently to every explanation, asking occasional questions that revealed a sharp mind and natural curiosity. Jake was impressed by how quickly the boy grasped the interconnected nature of ranch operations, understanding that each element depended on the others for success. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, they returned to the house for dinner. Jake prepared a simple meal of steak, potatoes, and vegetables, noting how Danny ate with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd learned not to waste food. "Tomorrow we'll start you on some basic chores," Jake said as they finished eating. "Nothing too complicated at first. Feeding the chickens, helping with the horses, maybe learning to use some of the hand tools. Sound manageable?" Danny nodded, then hesitated before speaking. "Jake, why did you really take me in, the truth?" Jake set down his fork and met the boy's direct gaze. "Because I was where you are once. Different circumstances, but the same feeling of being alone in the world with nobody who cared what happened to me. My grandfather could have left me to the state, but he didn't. He gave me a chance to prove myself, and it made all the difference. What happened to your parents? Car accident when I was 12. My grandfather was my father's father, and he stepped up even though he was already in his 60s and set in his ways. It wasn't easy for either of us, but it worked out." Danny processed this information silently, understanding passing between them that didn't require words. That night, as Danny lay in his new bed looking out at the star-filled Montana sky, he thought about the day's events. For the first time in weeks, he felt something approaching safety, though he was still too cautious to call it that. Jake seemed genuine, the work looked interesting, and the ranch felt like a place where someone could belong if they proved themselves worthy. In the room down the hall, Jake stared at his own ceiling, wondering if he'd made the right decision. Taking in a child was a responsibility he'd never imagined for himself, especially at his age. But something about Danny's quiet strength and determination reminded him of his younger self, and he found himself hoping that the ranch could work the same magic for this boy that it had worked for him decades ago. Outside, the night sounds of the ranch provided a peaceful backdrop to their separate contemplations. The gentle movement of horses in the paddock, the distant call of an owl, and the whisper of wind through the grass that would soon be covered by the first snows of winter. 3 weeks had passed since Danny's arrival at the Double M Ranch, and the first snow of the season dusted the Montana landscape like powdered sugar. The boy had settled into the rhythm of ranch life with a determination that both impressed and concerned Jake. Danny approached every task with the intensity of someone trying to prove their worth, as if a single mistake might result in abandonment. Jake watched from the kitchen window as Danny fed the chickens in the pre-dawn darkness, his small figure bundled in one of Jake's old coats that hung nearly to his ankles. The boy had insisted on taking over the morning chicken duties after his second day, claiming he liked the way the hens clucked contentedly when he scattered their feed. What Jake recognized but didn't voice was that Danny was trying to make himself indispensable. "Morning, son," Jake called as Danny stamped the snow off his boots on the back porch. "Coffee's ready if you want some hot chocolate instead." Danny nodded, unwinding the scarf Jake had bought him during their trip to town the previous week. The boy's cheeks were red from the cold, but his eyes held a satisfaction that came from completing his assigned tasks. "Chickens are all fed, and I collected 8 eggs, Danny reported, setting the basket on the counter with practiced care. "The new hen, the red one, she's still not laying regular. That's Henrietta. She's getting old, probably won't lay much longer," Jake explained, cracking eggs into a pan for breakfast. "But she's earned her retirement. Sometimes keeping animals isn't just about what they produce. It's about honoring the work they've already done." Danny considered this as he sipped his hot chocolate, a concept that seemed to resonate with him on a deeper level. Over the past weeks, Jake had noticed how carefully the boy listened to these casual observations about ranch philosophy, as if filing them away for future reference. "Jake," Danny said hesitantly, "Mrs. Henderson at the store? She asked me yesterday if I was settling in okay. And what did you tell her?" "I said yes, but—" Danny paused, choosing his words carefully. "She seemed surprised that you kept me, like she expected you to change your mind." Jake turned from the stove to face Danny directly. This was the conversation he'd been expecting, though he'd hoped it might come later, after Danny felt more secure. "People sometimes think they know what's best for others," Jake said carefully. "Martha Henderson means well, but she doesn't understand that taking someone in isn't about convenience or what looks easy from the outside. But what if they're right? What if I'm too much trouble?" The raw vulnerability in Danny's voice made Jake's chest tighten. He sat down across from the boy, giving him his full attention. "Danny, in 3 weeks you've learned to feed the chickens, help with the horses, and fix fence wire better than some grown men I've hired. You've never complained about early mornings or hard work, and you've shown more responsibility than kids twice your age. What exactly about that sounds like trouble to you?" Danny stared into his hot chocolate. "But I'm not really your family, and if something happens, if someone decides I should go somewhere else, look at me, son." Jake waited until Danny raised his eyes. "Family isn't just about blood. It's about choosing to stick by someone even when things get difficult." It's about showing up every day and doing the work, whether that's feeding chickens or listening when someone needs to talk. By that definition, you've been more family to me in 3 weeks than some people are in a lifetime. A commotion from the barn interrupted their conversation. Scout and Pepper began barking frantically, and Jake could hear the distressed lowing of cattle from the main pasture. "Something's wrong," Jake said, grabbing his coat and hat. "Danny, you stay here while I check it out." But Danny was already pulling on his boots, his jaw set with determination. "I can help," Jake started to argue, then saw the look in the boy's eyes. This wasn't childish curiosity. It was the expression of someone who understood that ranch life meant facing problems together. "All right, but you stay close to me and do exactly what I say." They hurried across the yard toward the commotion, their breath visible in the frigid morning air. In the main pasture, Jake could see several cattle clustered near the fence line, their agitation obvious even from a distance. As they got closer, the problem became clear. A section of fence had been damaged, probably by a fallen tree branch weighed down by snow, and 3 head of cattle had wandered through the gap onto the county road. "Damn," Jake muttered, then glanced apologetically at Danny. "Sorry about the language. I've heard worse," Danny said matter-of-factly, surprising Jake with his candor. The situation was potentially dangerous. The county road wasn't heavily traveled, but any vehicle coming around the blind curve near the ranch entrance could easily hit the wandering cattle. Jake needed to get them back into the pasture quickly, but herding cattle was typically a 2-person job, especially in winter conditions. "Here's what we're going to do," Jake said, formulating a plan. "I'll take Belle and try to guide them back through the gap. I need you to position yourself near the fence opening and help funnel them through. Think you can handle that?" Danny nodded, his face serious with the weight of responsibility. "What if they don't want to go? Cattle are herd animals. They want to be with the others. We just need to make it easier for them to do what they already want to do." Jake was already moving toward the barn to saddle Belle. "And Danny, if anything goes wrong, if they start moving toward you instead of the gap, you get behind that fence post and stay there. Understood?" "Understood." Jake saddled Belle with practiced efficiency, noting how Danny positioned himself exactly where he'd been instructed, his small figure alert and ready. The boy might be new to ranch work, but he had good instincts and, more importantly, he listened. The cattle were nervous, made skittish by the unfamiliar environment and the scent of predators that always seemed stronger after fresh snowfall. Jake approached them slowly on Belle, using gentle pressure to encourage them back toward their pasture. The lead cow, a sturdy Angus mix named Dolly, seemed to understand what was being asked of her and began moving in the right direction. The other 2 cattle followed, but one young steer decided to test Jake's patience by breaking away from the group and heading further down the road. Jake guided Belle in a wide arc to cut off the steer's escape route, all while keeping an eye on Danny's position. "Easy now," Jake called to both the animals and the boy. "Let him make the choice." Danny stood perfectly still as the steer approached the fence gap, resisting the natural urge to wave his arms or make noise that might spook the animal. Jake felt a surge of pride watching the boy's composure under pressure. The steer paused at the gap, sensing the presence of the other cattle in the pasture beyond. Danny took one small step to the side, not blocking the opening but simply indicating the preferred direction. It was a subtle movement that showed remarkable understanding for someone so new to working with livestock. The steer made his decision and trotted through the gap to rejoin the herd. Jake dismounted and quickly began repairing the fence with materials from the emergency kit he always carried, while Danny helped by holding posts steady and handing him tools. "You did good work out there," Jake said as they finished the temporary repair. "Kept your head, followed instructions, and showed real patience with that steer." Danny flushed with pride but tried to downplay his contribution. "You did all the hard work. Ranch work is teamwork, son. What you did was just as important as what I did. Maybe more so since you were the one who had to stand still and trust that everything would work out." As they walked back toward the house, Danny was quiet in the way Jake had learned meant he was processing something important. "Jake," Danny finally said, "when you said family is about showing up and doing the work, did you mean that?" "I meant every word. Then I want to learn everything, not just feeding chickens and holding fence posts. I want to learn to ride properly, and how to read weather signs, and how to know when a cow is getting sick before it shows symptoms. All of it." Jake stopped walking and looked down at the boy, seeing not just determination, but a kind of fierce commitment that reminded him powerfully of his grandfather. "That's a big undertaking, Danny. Ranch work isn't just a job, it's a way of life. It means being responsible for animals that depend on you, working in weather that would send most people indoors, and making decisions that affect the welfare of everything on this land. "I know," Danny said simply. "That's what I want." Jake extended his hand, and Danny shook it with the solemnity of someone sealing a sacred agreement. "All right then," Jake said. "We start with the horses tomorrow. Real riding lessons, not just leading them around the paddock." As they continued toward the house, Jake found himself thinking about the morning's events. Danny had faced his first real test as a member of the ranch team, and he'd passed with flying colors. More than that, he'd shown the kind of steady courage and good judgment that couldn't be taught. It had to come from within. The boy was no longer just someone who needed help. He was becoming a true partner in the work of the ranch, and Jake realized that somewhere in the past 3 weeks, Danny had stopped being a responsibility and started being family.